Hey, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for coming out to tonight's event. My name is Kelly Jo Brick. I am the vice chair of the WGA Genre Committee. We're so glad you're here tonight. We also invite you to join us for our future genre committee meetings. Our next meeting is the first Tuesday in December. It's where we plan events just like this one, and also where we get to know our fellow genre writers. A couple quick thank yous before we get started. First of all, to our panelists for sharing their time and experiences with us tonight. Really excited to hear what they have to say. Also to the subcommittee who helped bring this event together, and to Greg, our guild liaison, who worked so hard for this committee and for so many others. So I'd like to introduce our moderator for this evening, Lori Rosene-Gambino. She's the one who brought this idea to us and championed it all the way through to tonight. Lori is a WGA member whose screenplay, The Murderer Among Us, about the making of Fritz Lang's M, was on the blacklist. She's currently writing a social horror film of her own called The Anniversary for Oscar-nominated Polish director Jan Komasa. Lori, take it away.
Thank you, Kelly Jo and the WGA Genre Committee. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for Nightmare on Our Street, Social Commentary in Modern Horror. So horror has been a vehicle for social commentary going all the way back to Frankenstein, Night of the Living Dead, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, to contemporary films like Get Out, It Follows, and the Purge franchise. Hell, we should probably throw in The Social Network at this point. The best social horror films and television represent their times and examine the fears of their generation, like the ones created by our panelists tonight. I'm excited to have this conversation with our guests, so let me introduce them. Bryan Fuller is a writer, producer who has created a number of television series, including Dead Like Me, Wonder Falls, Pushing Daisies, Hannibal, and American Gods. He's also the creator of Star Trek Discovery. Gerard Bush is a writer, director, producer, and activist. He is half of the duo of Bush plus Renz. Their work includes the 2020 film Antebellum. Their upcoming projects include the feature Rapture and the documentary All Deliberate Speed. Renz isn't here tonight, unfortunately, could make it. I feel like I can now call you Bush minus Renz.
Well, let's not do that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's Gerard. And then we also have our television show at HBO, Inkwell, which is another genre sort of thing. So,
awesome.
Yeah.
Great. And Gigi Saul Guerrero is a writer, director, and actress. She created the web series La Quinceañera. In 2019, she directed episodes of the Purge series and wrote and directed Culture Shock for the anthology horror series Into the Dark. Her current film is Bingo Hell. James DeMonaco is a writer, director, and producer. He's best known for the Purge franchise and writing all 5 films and directing the first 3. He also created the television series, and his new dramatic feature is This Is the Night. April Wolfe is a writer, producer, director, and podcaster. She is a former film critic for the LA Weekly and Village Voice. She recently co-wrote the 2019 horror film Black Christmas, and she's also known for this great podcast, which I mentioned earlier, Switchblade Sisters. Professor George Vahamikos is an academic based at Boston University. He teaches a class on contemporary American horror. He's taught Spanish Gothic horror at Harvard. He's lectured on topics ranging from the transformation of horror in the aftermath of 9/11 to the outbreak before and after the pandemic. So welcome, everyone. Let's begin with Professor Vahamikos. He's going to sort of provide some context for the panel discussion tonight. So George, please take it away.
Thank you for the very kind introduction. The most I can say about myself is that I'm a professional appreciator of so many of the talents on this panel tonight. And I just want to start our conversation tonight with a question. Like, what makes a horror film more than just a horror film? Like any popular film genre, horror has had its peaks and its valleys. But unlike some genres that experience long periods of decline and virtual absence from the screen, every time the monsters of one era become so familiar that they become laughable, a new variation comes along to make America anxious again. Think of the alien invaders of the 1950s, the slashers of the 1980s, or the supernatural craze of the early 2000s. And in the midst of these sorts of ebbs and flows, there's been at least two periods of so much productivity and creativity that they've been thought of as kind of golden ages, right? The first dawned with the release of films like Dracula and James Whale's Frankenstein. They were the first motion pictures to be called horror movies, and they set the stage for the genre to this very day. That second golden age comes in the 1960s and the early 70s, beginning with George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, a time where there was an onslaught of really inventive, transgressive, and brutal horror films that effectively redefined the parameters of what the genre is or could be. I think it's notable that these two periods of remarkable productivity were also periods of deep political and cultural turmoil, in one case generated by the Depression in the 30s, and by the political unrest of the anti-war, the civil rights, and other kind of social movements in the 1960s. And those who really write about horror movies kind of underscore this general sense that horror has this unique sensitivity to anxiety and to conflict. But since 2016, there's been a new renaissance of horror filmmaking. And if we're in the midst of something like a third golden age, it is a result of instability and turmoil, and that turmoil has a name: Donald Trump. And of course, the tensions and conflicts that are not all these tensions and conflicts were caused by the 45th president of the United States, but the ascendancy of Donald Trump has had a major effect on our cinematic visions. We see in it rising fears fueled by xenophobia, nationalism, racism, misogyny, anti-Semitism, anti-immigrant rhetoric. And recent horror films and television series have been tapping into these dark emotions for some time now. And it seems likely in the years to come that we'll just see a continuation of that kind of productivity and boldness that I think characterizes the past few years. So what makes those films unique? These most recent films, I think, experiment one with specific conventions of horror filmmaking, but more than anything else, I think they give vent to a lot of contemporary feelings of outrage, of grief, and despair. They're films that challenge America's most deeply cherished values and the prevailing status quo in this country. They lament the decay of civil discourse and even agonize over this great American experiment in democracy. Many of them demand systemic change, sometimes even revolution. And if you haven't been watching horror over the past few years, then you probably should, and not just what pops up, in your mobile notifications or in your daily news feed. These most recent films remind us that America has always been a frightening place. Not just since the 45th president got himself elected. They force us into the sometimes uncomfortable realization that the United States has always been a land of fear and unfreedom, from its first foundations to the most recent attacks on our national capital. So what I want to just do right now is just kind of observe some common trends that I've seen in contemporary horror films after watching and rewatching, teaching and reteaching, and talking about them in many different academic settings. Killer clowns proliferate in Trump era media, from Pennywise, Andy Muschietti recent adaptation of It, to the gang of those murderous clowns that terrorizes a liberal Michigan community in Ryan Murphy's American Horror Story Cult. And they might help us make sense of the really chaotic rise of the Trump regime. The figure of the homicidal clown that's lethal and unpredictable, it's a staple of horror since the 1980s. And in the present, I think that kind of psychotic, carnival atmosphere reflects something about the insanity of American violence and the increasing madness of the three-ring circus that we call our politics. Now, popular horror often stands accused of being misogynistic and sexist, But horror has been playing, I think, a really important role in representing and mobilizing female resistance to the anti-woman agenda of Trump. They offer us really interesting insights into why female characters are still being enslaved or raped or mutilated in horror movies, and how we might understand their screams, their fall, their rise as expressions of resistance in the age of Trump. Queer representation on screen has taken also, I think, a decidedly progressive turn and moved towards narratives of survival and resilience in the years leading up to Trump. And there are numerous examples of LGBTQ characters having the kind of strength and the adaptability to fend for themselves. I'm thinking about things like Coleman Domingo's Victor Strand in Fear of the Walking Dead. I'm thinking about Sarah Paulson, Allie in American Horror Story. And representation in horror matters because character deaths tell us a lot about who is seen in society, right, and who matters. There's also a really growing trend in horror in which an ordinary white male is the antagonist, and often a repeated scenario in which a woman is discovered chained up or locked up in a cellar or in a basement. And I think this, very common horror trope intersects maybe with one of the refrains of Trump's presidential campaign, the chant "lock her up." Right? Films like Fede Alvarez's Don't Breathe or Dan Trachtenberg's 10 Cloverfield Lane, even James DeMonaco's Purge election year, I think explore ways in which white men's kind of perceived loss of power and desire to avenge a sense of powerlessness gets enacted on screen, particularly against powerful women. And I think it's worth pointing out that none of these women, of course, ever stay locked up. The pervasive bigotry of liberal white America gets lampooned, of course, in Jordan Peele's race-savvy satire Get Out. This fearless horror film skewers race relations in America by exploring the white social spaces that Black Americans have to navigate. It's a landmark film that I think awakened the nation from a collective delusion that in the aftermath of Barack Obama's election, America had become a post-racial society. And Peele's second film, Us, follows, interestingly, an upwardly mobile Black family as they attempt to find a sense of belonging in a homogeneously white world. And for the Wilsons in this movie, assimilation is largely something economic. They're trying to find ways to signal that they too are the American dream. The price of that assimilation, though, is the erasure of their own individual identity and maybe finally even their own Blackness. And at the end of Jordan Peele's Us, this Black family, interestingly enough, escapes the violence of revolution by crossing the border into Mexico, right? And border crossing, both legal and extra legal, is a constant theme in post-2016 horror. And maybe it's dramatized most powerfully by Gigi Saul Guerrero's Culture Shock, right? In which an unwed and heavily pregnant mother makes the choice to escape domestic violence and despair by crossing illegally into the United States. By the end of that film, she rejects the hostile world she encounters and returns to Mexico to face the future on her own terms. And like Guerrero, the Forever Purge, the most recent installment in the Purge franchise, sets its action along America's southern border, portraying Americans who are fleeing the anarchy and white supremacy of Texas for the safety of Mexico. And I think maybe these repeated flights from America that we see not only challenge Donald Trump's immigration rhetoric, but maybe they also call into question notions of America as a bastion of liberty and a sanctuary to the oppressed. And just in closing here, I just want to really emphasize, I think these most recent movies, project our culture's dreams and nightmares, our highest aspirations and maybe our most demoralizing failures. We can't fully know ourselves or know our own country without sitting in the dark and contemplating these searing and sometimes enigmatic images that so many of the talents here tonight have had a hand in creating. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Wow. Okay, well, that's going to be a hard act to follow. I feel like we just had an audit of your class, and I want to take that class. But anyways, let me jump right in with our panelists. I'm going to start with James. James, the Purge franchise has been such fertile ground for socio-political commentary. You've explored themes like class system, capitalist inequality, failed economic policy, racism. Then I'm going to jump right in and talk about January 6th, and we're seeing these things playing out right in front of us. First, I really want to know what that day was like for you.
It was weird because people who had seen Forever Purge, which hadn't been out already, were shocked at how similar it was to the day. So it was one of the sad. I actually wept. I think a lot of us wept on that day. So it was incredibly one of the saddest days I've had since 9/11. So it was, and I was pissed off to all hell, as I've been for the last 5 or 6 years. I think it crescendoed on that day. And but I kept getting calls like, "Wow, you predicted all this, and is the purge next? Is it going to come real?" Which makes me very sad. And I always say, like, that's the worst question I can get. I've always written this dystopian, insane B-movie conceit, never thinking a day would come where people would be like, "Wow, this is kind of like America now." And so yeah, it was probably the saddest day that I can remember since 9/11 being. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think we all feel that way.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna ask you a craft question next. Yeah. So I just want to kind of tell us about your story sort of rules for the franchise, and then how that sort of evolved maybe, you know, after the 2016 election and with the new film you're writing, and how that sort of evolved with the culture.
Yeah, it's definitely taken an evolution, the franchise. It had some, you know, there was definitely a social relevance. It was built out of my, I grew up hating guns. There were a lot of guns around me in the Staten Island, Brooklyn world I grew up in, and I was always very terrified of guns where I grew up. So, and then I spent a year in France posting my first film that I directed, and I didn't meet one human being who had a gun. So it was built out of this hatred of guns, this fear, I should say fear of guns that I had. And then I started seeing that America had a very unique relationship with guns, and the lack of what I thought were the proper gun control laws is where the seed of the idea came from. That if we don't have proper gun control laws, we want everyone to have a gun, aren't we saying then we should use these guns? And this holiday was born, this fictional holiday that I came up with, or my wife kind of said something in a car one day after a road rage incident. But anyway, that's a long story. But so yeah, but it's evolved. It started from that. It became about class. It became about the government's treatment of the poor. After Sandy, there were various things that led to that. But what's evolved, I think my anger over the last 5 or 6 years has crept into the piece. I always say that the studio yells at me quite often about keeping my anger and views out of the scripts, but it's impossible. It's impossible not to let the socio-political atmosphere that we're all living in this this insane time seep into the pen, into the computer, and get into the especially in Purge 4 and 5. Well, starting in 3, I should say. And then especially coming into 4 and 5, it really, I couldn't keep it out. And it became a check and balance system, talking about process with the studio and my producers, where they're like, you know, you can't keep proselytizing. This isn't some forum for your views about America and what America should be and what it shouldn't be. So I like what George said, that we should be challenging ourselves to say, how can we make this country better, instead of just sitting here saying we're the greatest country in the world. We're, you know, let's see the flaws, let's fill them in. And I always said, if we can work within our genre to start asking maybe our genre can help ask the right questions, because it reaches a great audience. If I made a film, a drama about gun control laws, I don't think I can get to the same audience I can with the Purge movies. So it's a great way to smuggle these ideas into. But the practical writing of it has definitely evolved, because my anger has grown so much over not to be so maudlin tonight and angry, but it's kind of an angry time.
All of our work, absolutely.
Yeah. So I think it's hard to. So I think the evolution of my anger has changed. That we've gotten more political, and the directors we hired for 4 and 5 were equally as pissed off as I was over the current social events, political events. So I think it got even more political and sociological relevant, I should say, in 4 and 5 than the previous 3 were. I hope I answered the question. I don't know if I did.
Yeah, thank you. And you mentioned a little bit about this, but so then how do you calibrate sort of the balance between horror and message, and how was sort of the message strengthened or softened, like, you know, in the writing process or even in the editorial process?
Yeah, that's the toughest part, because you don't want to be right. We don't want to be just preaching to the audience. We're here to entertain on a certain level. We want to, and we're trying to smuggle ideas into these things. I am trying to, and have some social relevance. But it's a fine line, because it is, you know, The Purge is a big studio movie. It's a Universal film, and they want to make sure I'm not pushing it. So I have a great producerial team that's constantly checking me. It's funny that we brought up Trump right in the beginning of this. A mandate immediately was you can't say Trump in the movies. You can't say it. You can't use the word Trump. You can allude to the whole 5th movie is about the Trump wall. And the original draft was the Trump wall burning and people climbing into Mexico and they're getting shot by these Nazis and all this crazy shit. But we couldn't use the word Trump wall. So there's all these little things, but it
Did you get some Trump nods into that, by the way? Were you able to insert some stuff that was
we sneak, if people watch the DVD, they can find out a little. Yeah, it's all in there. But we have to be, but listen, I always say the Purge movies are not subtle in any way, other than I'm not using the word Trump. They're not subtle films. I think my views and are clear as day in what we're trying to say. I think the strange thing for me, and I'm probably going off, I'm digressing into another thing here, is, you know, we all test off. I think we all hear test off films multiple times, especially in the studio, is the interpretation of the film is very different based on audience race. I don't want to get into too much of a controversial area here, but the Purge film, the interpretation of the Purge films, and this is after what, we have 5 movies, each is tested 3 times with 300 people in the audience. So, and I read every single card, and we finally realized there's an incredible pattern as to who sees my intention of what the films are really about and who doesn't. And it's fascinating in that Black, Latino, Asian audiences see the film as one thing, and white males see it completely differently. And that's been the biggest learning thing. I'm going off topic here, Lloyd, but that's been the biggest learning.
What do you mean exactly? What is the...
Well, they see the Purge films are interpreted by white males as simply white males between, I should say, 20 and 35. They just see it as very cool and badass. Whereas the ethnic audiences, the Black, Latino, and Asian audiences see it as a metaphor for their plight in America. They see, I guess, the themes and the socio-political themes that we're trying to smuggle into the piece. Yeah. Yet it's completely lost. And you see this in the commentary on the cards. Wow. That's what's so fascinating about the process of the studio screenings. And yeah, it's been an incredible learning curve. So we are tweaking to try to reach a broader audience, to try to bridge that kind of incongruity between our audiences, to see if we can continuously, in the edit or in the rewriting of it all, can we somehow get them all on the same page? That'll never happen, I understand, but it's a hell of a process.
Was there anything sort of categorically that you were told you've got to cut? We just, you know, for political reasons, you just can't do that. Anything you were kind of like fighting for?
Yeah, well, the Trump, any allusions to Trump, any allusions to the Trump wall were all cut. What else? I've been really surprised, I should say, at Universal, of what they've let us keep in. We had, you know, Purges dressed up as policemen, beating a black man in Purge 4. And they let us keep it in the film. And this was in the height of some troubles we were having here in New York City with riots, and they let us keep it in the film. So no, nothing. They've been really open to keeping things in, other than staying away from the word Trump.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that makes sense. Yeah. And the last question is, because there's a little rumor that you're writing a new Purge film, and I don't know how you're going to top sort of what real life, but so what can you tell us about it, if anything?
Yeah, so Purge 6 was born. I'd say I didn't want to do, I thought I was done with 5, but I said that about 3, and then 5 was going to be the last one. It was the end of America. America was burning at the end of 5. So I thought that was the completion. And then after January 6th, I woke up, I had an idea about how we can continue. So sadly, I always say it's kind of sad that I have new Purge ideas, because it's such an indictment of the American system. or the American political system. But no, it's about America 10 years into the future, and it speaks to the discord in the country and how we've, I can say I've said this and other things, it's how we're breaking down into America has been remapped. We've been tribalized completely. And so the new America we see is not broken down into the states we know. We're broken down into how we identify ourselves. And so that's how we re-enter this new America that's born out of Purge 5. So yeah, we'll see if it gets made. I don't know. It's written. We'll see if the cinema gods want it, and we'll take it from there.
I want to see that film. Okay, I'm going to move on to Gigi. Thank you, James. Professor George mentioned the humanitarian crisis at our southern border and the real life horrors sort of playing out, or not sort of, but playing out. And you use all that in Culture Shock. They're really heavy themes that you sort of imbue with a Dorothy and Oz kind of a, utopian America concept. So I want you to please talk about sort of that bold choice.
No, for sure. Well, funny enough, let me just say my lookbook when I pitched for this was all of James's movies, like all of it. Pretty much my lookbook was, when I went in, I was like, this is Pleasantville gone wrong. And it was like The Purge, like all over my presentation. So that was good times, good memories. No, when I first read the script, it had a different name. It was called Crossing. And one of the things I felt as a filmmaker, because of what was happening at that time, at the border crisis, and me being Mexican, also an immigrant here in Canada, I couldn't help but be so sad every day, turning on the news. It was really affecting me. It was affecting the whole world, watching this. People being separated from their kids, being in cages. Basically, it was so visceral that time that when I read the script, I felt it was such a responsibility on my end to not just tell the story, but be honest. I felt that this was my part to be that filmmaker that could bring awareness to what is happening. It's already a really tough topic to talk about. I couldn't agree more with James. Just the word Trump can't really say it. And I felt if I take this movie, I'm gonna make it as Mexicano as possible.
Yes.
And that was one of the things I said. I said, look, I think this is a very vanilla script. And I think with what is going on, let's be not subtle about it and let's go for it. So that was when I came on as a co-writer to bring those big changes, bring that authenticity. And what excited me was, okay, this is a genre film, yes, but why not show literally the perspective of what it means to experience two different worlds? And by that, I mean, as an immigrant, you move from one world, your country, to another country. It's so hard to compare the two. I still get asked today, do you prefer Mexico or do you prefer Canada? I'm like, man, I can't tell you that. It's two different worlds. So
did you experience culture shock? Is something you experienced personally, I'm sure?
Yeah. So like really the visual style of culture shock, that insane drastic change from Mexico to, in quotes, the American dream. I wanted people to really feel that there is almost another world, that some people have that desperation that they want, that have believed in, that exists, when that's not the case. And, to answer your question just a little bit further, I just felt that it was a responsibility to make this film as specific as possible to what is going on.
Yeah.
To, even though it felt like 3 movies in one, with the big reveal at the end, where we reveal where these people were really experiencing the American dream in the most horrible of ways. I thought it was just really important to go as far in that direction as possible.
It is important. And I mean, I can't even imagine what it was like, for any immigrant coming from the southern border, and what the dog whistles of the president and the first lady in that jacket and the things that she was said about not believing children. I mean, just horrific stuff.
Yeah, and I felt, you know, it was important in the script to showcase Mexico, and in a way, like, I'm Mexican, and I do see these border crossing movies a lot, that, you know, make it seem like, oh well, I'd leave Mexico too. But it was important for me to, you know, as George mentioned in his awesome speech, it was important to change the stereotype at the end of the film.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's worth going back home and actually looking back at where you're from. You know, we all have very different destinies and very different journeys that I wanted to break that stereotype very, very much. Um, because I think to want to cross the border illegally, as scary as it is and as scary as we portrayed it in the film, you have to go through some insane level of desperation to want to do that. And everybody has a very different reason to want to do that. So, you know, we had to really showcase through the different characters where they're all coming from. But at the end of the day, uh, you know, Lori, at the end of the day, everybody deserves the best life. At the end of the day, everybody deserves a better life, no matter what your situation is. So, you know, I think forcing people into a culture is not the way to do it. Everyone deserves a choice. So I wanted to have that at the end
Yeah.
of the film.
You
Yeah.
did that so beautifully. And I really love the end of the film, by the way. And
Oh,
that
thank you.
back into Mexico. So I want to jump and talk about your latest film, Bingo Hell, which is sort of a just jump is sort of a unique take on the devil comes to town, with the story being set sort of in a community that's becoming gentrified, and this bingo like hall that preys upon sort of the economically strapped citizens, and particularly like its seniors. Why were those issues important for you?
No, definitely. You know, Bingo Hell was very much inspired by my abuela, who's obsessed with bingo, like obsessed, like scary, like religiously obsessed. So, you know, the idea came just, what would happen if we took bingo away from her? Honey, you better run. She's gonna kill someone. Hide. But working on the script more and more, to me, it was super important to bring these topics of gentrification, uh, break the stereotype of ageism, of the weak and old. And it felt so organic to pair the two, of having seniors as the heroes in a gentrified setting. I've witnessed a lot that seniors, they're the easiest target for a lot of these things, that they have no control. Even they're the ones on the phone falling for the scams. You know, it's so sad.
Yeah.
And so, you know, for me, it was really important to have them be the ones that kick ass.
Yes.
Yeah. And Richard Brake, who plays Mr. Big, the villain in the film, who,
Yeah.
yeah, I guess it is portrayed sort of as the devil. He really was. And for me, what was exciting was bringing a villain that was fun, that was charming, but that really represented just our corrupt system of how easy we can wipe out the old. And we wanted to just, of anything that is old, wipe it out, bring in the new, get rid of anything that is old. And that really fell into place nicely with the themes of gentrification.
Yeah.
That we witness down the street, I think, in any of our homes, that
Yeah.
people don't have that control.
Remind us of the name of your lead actor. She's so
Oh,
brilliant.
yeah, Adriana Barraza. So she plays Lupita.
Yeah.
And I mean, I just wanted someone to portray my grandma with a shotgun. I was like, okay, we gotta make this fun. But you know, talking of all
Did
these,
Paula approve? Did she approve the casting?
yeah. Oh, she was a blast. But talking about all these social horrors, you know, I think what makes it so interesting to watch these films is that we're bringing the fun factor, the entertainment factor. You know, I think what we see in the news and media, social media, it's so heartbreaking. I think all of us as storytellers in this room, and all the talent out there, we don't want people to suffer another 90 minutes watching our stuff. We want to bring that fun factor. Yeah, some of them are a little more intense than others. Definitely the difference between Culture Shock and Bingo Hell is a pretty big one. Bingo Hell, I just went for like we're just gonna have a good time with this one. And that's it. And with Culture Shock, it was like I really wanted to be in people's face about the subject matter because of how present the border crisis was. But at the end of the day, I want people to be able to sit through it. If they have fun, if they have the scares, if they have the laughter, cover their eyes, blah, blah, blah. If at the end of the movie they can talk about it, I did my job. And I think that's that awesome awareness we can bring as storytellers, especially in the genre world. We can talk about anything. Bring in monsters, bring in whatever. That topic is really crystal clear of what is going on and the problems that we have. Yeah.
Those factors that you mentioned, sort of, the blending of like dark comedy and gore and supernatural with social commentary, because that can get tricky, right?
Yes.
Just talk about sort of getting that balance right.
No, for sure. Like I said, Bingo Hell especially went through this wild process of pre-pandemic, then write a script during pandemic, then write a script still in pandemic. Like we went through every journey and emotion trying to make a movie during these conditions. And I felt very emotional during that time as well, that it it started off really grounded. But then I just said to myself, man, I just want the Goonies with old people. I just wanted to have fun. I just wanted to laugh and give people that. Especially with what we're going through, still are today. So I find that balance, I think horror and comedy are a very beautiful parallel, to be completely honest with you.
Absolutely.
I think it's those two genres that are literally called the emotion you want people to feel. You want to horrify them or you want to make them laugh. It's also, I can tell you from my parents, they laugh out of nerves. So there's such a beautiful connection with the two, that it's a form of release, that when we watch these horror films, you laugh when you're nervous as well. Some of us, I'm sure James is that guy, yeah, when it's gory and awesome. Yeah, some of us cheer. But I think that balance goes so well hand in hand, because it's the two emotions that we're sharing, of these two specific genres, comedy and horror.
That
They're
was
the
beautiful
exact
way
same
to describe
balance.
it. I like how you mentioned your parents, sir.
Oh, one day they'll watch my films. One day. One day they'll get through it.
I want to ask you, as an emerging Latina filmmaker, do you feel a responsibility to continue to tell Latinx stories? Are there other issues, stories that you want to explore?
Oh, that's an awesome question. Yeah, I feel, I'm still new in the industry, but I feel so lucky to be a filmmaker right now, when diversity, authenticity, new fresh voices are really coming into play and being so recognized and considered. I don't think this opportunity to tell these kinds of stories for me as a young Latina filmmaker would have been this possible 10 years ago, let's just say. So I feel right now is a great time to really talk about all the things that really represent me. And I think breaking the border and those stereotypes, I still feel when somebody's Latino, right away, they're like, oh, you're Mexican. No, man. No, I'm not. Like everyone thinks there's just this one square of it all. And I think we need to continue to encourage authentic voices to tell their authentic stories. So we learn. Our audience is the ones that will continue to spread the awareness of these stories. So I personally do want to continue in that direction, but I'm still new, my friend. So I'm open to all the possibilities to just make cool stuff. Yeah,
Awesome.
for sure.
Thank you, Gigi.
Okay,
you. I want to go to Bryan, and Bryan, I want to ask, so your unique perspective on like one of horror's most iconic characters, Hannibal Lecter, has been so much, we've talked about. How did you tackle his sexuality in a way that we hadn't seen before? And tell us about making him pansexual, and how the sort of oh geez, that was a misfire there. LGBTQ narratives sort of, evolved throughout like all 3 seasons?
I didn't have an agenda in terms of Hannibal's sexual identity. It just sort of blossomed from a place where Mads Mikkelsen, in our first meeting, said, "Oh, he's the devil." Like his attraction to humanity is the same reason the devil is attracted to humanity, and that's really kind of boiling down to he loves beautiful things in all their forms and beautiful people in all their forms. And so it just kind of evolved into a queer read when really I just wanted to set out and explore what a non-sexual romance is between 2 straight guys. And then I was like, oh, maybe they're a little gay.
That's awesome. Okay, so I want to talk about, it's mentioned in the pilot that Hannibal's written this thesis paper on social exclusion.
Yes.
Which kind of refers to communities that are sort of systematically blocked from rights and opportunities. Talk about how that applied to the character and sort of the themes you were going for.
I think one of the fun things for me about the character Hannibal is that there's a very dark comedy at work for a psychiatrist who wants to eat you and yet is a good psychiatrist, but has a basic sort of moral ethical rule of eat the rude. Like if you're a pig of a human being, then you deserve to be somebody's bacon type of thing. And so I think there is this kind of Batman-esque heroism to him, just eating the people that we would all sort of would rather not be bothered with on some level. So the fantasy of that is certainly part of the fun and the comedy of the show. And really that's about anybody who feels othered in some way gets to have a champion of sorts that if you're just not an asshole, you're not on his menu. And that's sort of a grand equalizer in some way. Just don't be a dick.
Yeah, I stand by that rule. So as a writer kind of known for horror and supernatural stories, what in those genres allows you to kind of explore like the other thing themes like authentically?
Well, I think that's one of the exciting things about horror and horror's origin is that it has always been queer, coming from queer voices, whether it's Mary Shelley's bisexuality or even the thirsty letters that Bram Stoker wrote to Walt Whitman that sort of were the smoking gun of his sexuality. There's always been a sense of the other in these narratives. Also, I think something unique to queer people is just we have a different relationship with our bodies sometimes because we've had to think about it a little bit more or defend it or articulate it in some way. So there's something about the horror stimulates the same reaction to porn. Like it's your body telling you that you're engaged in something, whether you're consciously thinking about it or not. And it kind of goes to what Gigi was saying earlier about comedy and horror. There is a wonderful attraction and a bit of a crutch for all of us who love this genre. The stakes are automatically really high, and it's usually about people who feel on the outside of society in some way. Those are the monsters, and even Oscar Wilde famously was drawn as the monster when he was finally arrested for homosexual dalliances and stuff, and they had comic book strips of him in a cage, and it was like the monster is finally caged. So there's always been this intrinsic social commentary that's coming from queer angles with horror that's really exciting, and it continues to evolve in all of the genres, whether it's lesbian vampires or lesbian ghosts or lesbian housekeepers, like worshiping a lesbian ghost. You know, so it's just a genre that speaks to the queer experience so very quickly and almost with the pedigree and DNA of queer storytellers. So I find it irresistible on that front.
Well said. So have you ever experienced any sort of network or studio resistance? And if so, like, how did you deal with notes and or potentially kind of, you know, compromising your vision on anything?
On Hannibal, honestly, it was a breeze because the stakes were very low. They could allow us to be a little bit different because we weren't given the responsibility of achieving a mainstream demographic. They were like, oh, it's going to be this weird little show. And they let us be a weird little show. So, and the standards and practices were like some of the most fun I've had. With Joanna Jameson, who is the standards and practices executive at NBC. And she was a ball. You know, I'd call her and just say, this guy has to, you know, cut off his face and feed it to dogs. How do we do that? And she was like, well, you know, make the blood black and just put as much of it in shadow and just do it with sounds. And so that's what we did. And she was wonderful, a wonderful asset that way. Earlier in my career, certainly there were, you know, characters that were queer characters that were made straight. That was, you know, frustrating. And you know, Wonder Falls had a queer character that we just had to cut like a frame away from lips connecting with anybody of the same sex, so they could lean in, but they couldn't quite touch. And so that just became sort of like, oh, that's the slalom. That was the slalom at that time. It was the early aughts. And, you know, so having that be one of my earlier experiences and having gay characters turn straight to being able to do this wild, flaming, bareback sex scene in American Gods was really an interesting evolution and sort of like 2 points on the spectrum that we have come a long way, but we still have a lot. We have much road to travel ahead of us in terms of representation and equality, and nobody flinching at a same-sex kiss or being in a theater where it's booed, which still, you know, happens with Freaky, the movie that came out last autumn. There was a body switch with Vincent D'Onofrio. And that movie was wonderful because it got all the pronouns right. If a female was in a male body, the pronouns were she and her, and vice versa. So it was really savvy that way. But there was a same-sex kiss between Vince Vaughn. Sorry, wrong Vincent. And a teenage boy, and like it got booed and hissed, and there was still like the reaction to it. But for a lot of people in the queer community, it is progress that the filmmakers didn't have any shame about that story point. It was just, we're still dealing with the audience.
Yeah, I know Vincent, and I was like, I had not heard that he had done that film or anything about it.
It's a cute movie. It's a really cute movie.
Yeah, I have to see that. So I want to ask you about Chef Jose Andres. This is, I was so excited when I found out about this. So he was your culinary expert or consultant on the show on Hannibal. And so I kind of want you to talk about just sort of the idea of like a real life humanitarian, like coming into the writer's room, and then also tell us about the food, obviously. But yeah, I'd love for you to sort of speak to that.
Well, Jose worked very closely with Janice Poon, who was our food stylist. And usually I met Jose at the opening of the Bazaar, or he had just got one of his many like humanitarian awards, and there was a celebration at that restaurant. And I told him that, you know, we're doing a show about Hannibal, who is, you know, a famous cannibal, and I need to work with somebody who knows a lot more about food than I do. And he was like, I'm in. And then he started pitching ideas immediately about all these wild ways to cook human beings. Just like he'd thought about it, or that he's just so used to working with animals that it's not that different. And that was one of the first things that he said, that chefs talk about it all the time, because you're breaking down a body. And then you're going to eat it. It's hard not to have the idea of that being a human being creep in every once in a while.
Yeah.
But he was delightful and authentically perverse, in a way that was having a really good time, and thinking like, well, if you're dealing with crazy people and crazy people got to eat, they would prepare, this body part that way. And it was always just really thoughtful. And then he would provide the history of how that dish was prepared. So honestly, it was one of the favorite collaborations that I've ever had was with Jose Andres.
Oh, that's awesome. We have a mutual friend who said, I must ask you about John Carpenter.
Oh, I love John Carpenter, and there is something interesting. Talk about politics and horror. John Carpenter is somebody who claims not to care about politics and just wants to tell a good story. So either he's bullshitting all of us and just doesn't want to articulate more beyond that, or he really is revealing the potential for politics inherent in any sort of horror dynamic, because you're going to have oppressors and the oppressed, and insiders and outsiders. So all of those things automatically become political, even in something that's such an elegant, efficient horror film like Prince of Darkness. He's talking about homeless problems post Reagan, sort of creating the homeless issue kind of single-handedly in the 80s. Carpenter had a comment on that. He had a comment on physics. So he's a guy who has so many curiosities and puts them in his films, and is such an efficient storyteller. It's interesting to I'm definitely like a big fan of his. I have there's DVDs right there that are his. So
study.
Yeah. I see James nodding. I would like is everybody a Carpenter fan? I mean, he's kind of
he's the best. Yeah, They Live is so political. It's in I know he says that he's not, but it's the most. I just watched it the other day. It's like, John, come on, just say what it is. Now he's my favorite. So yeah, he's a wonderful.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, let's move on to Gerard. So I want to talk about in Antebellum. You have a modern day author who's transported to 19th century as a slave. It's just really incredible, visceral, genre bending, idea. Tell us about sort of the genesis of the concept and kind of using the plantation reenactment construct for it.
Well, I mean, for me, the story started from a nightmare that I had. And in that nightmare, it really played out pretty much essentially the way that it did in the film. And I'd love to say, as a person, I consider myself to be relatively well-read, pretty well-traveled, but I could not remember exactly what the word antebellum meant. I knew it was in pop culture. I'd seen the word. I'm embarrassed to say, it was it wasn't so intimate with me. And in the nightmare, she passed by the sign that said antebellum, and I was like, oh my God, and so when I Googled it the next morning, and I was like, antebellum, that means before the Civil War, an American Civil War. And I can tell you, being a Black kid that grew up in Texas and having to sort of grin and bear it when white kids and their parents would have conversations about films like Gone with the Wind, or any of sort of what was acceptable within pop culture, my sort of comfort had to be a casualty of those conversations, to actually engage in them. Because the way that I thought about what James said with the testing and the 3 times that films were tested in 300-person audience, and young white men would say, oh, well, this was this was great, this was a laugh, it was a completely different experience and perception. And so when I thought about my discomfort in watching a film like Gone with the Wind, and how, although albeit it's a beautiful film and it's beautifully shot and all of that, for me it's a horror film. And so the best way to sort of put that, to give that perspective, was to shoot it, and we also use the Gone with the Wind lenses to shoot that film, but was to say, look, let's show you what the beauty, what it takes to maintain this facade of beauty, this really sweeping antebellum South. How do we achieve that? Well, we achieve that through the enslavement and the brutality that's inflicted upon other human beings in order for us to maintain, you know, this idyllic lifestyle that really doesn't exist.
Tell us about sort of also the choice, like to go, you know, the chronology, and you know, was that always the plan when you were writing it? Or is that something that you came to later?
I mean, you know, I as an artist who happens to write and to, you know, want to put something on film and hope that maybe a dozen people will watch it, you know, at the end of the day, for me, it's got to feel right, and it's not a strategy so much.
Mm-hmm.
I think when we were writing, Christopher and I together, what was really fascinating was to indoctrinate and to immerse the audience, the reader, and then eventually the audience in the idea that you are actually in the antebellum South, that you're actually having that experience. And so then that's a part of the gag, because when you move back from the modern era into the antebellum South, ostensibly the antebellum South, then you have a totally different perception of it than you did when you were in the first act. So that was important to us in order to deliver the point that we were trying to make.
Well, and I love how you incorporated your own dream sort of into it, with the character who wakes up and, you know, from that horrific place, and she wakes up to that, so that you've incorporated, listen to your dreams. So talk about sort of, you know, you have this very arresting like oneer in the opening. It's so stunning. It's so gorgeous.
Oh,
and then it's bookended with Janelle Monáe's character in this very sort of upending of the patriarchal South with its monuments and its flags. Just tell us about, you know, how you achieve that, and that aesthetic choice.
Well, it was a very difficult shot to get because we only had 26 days to shoot. You know,
Wow.
yeah, we had 26 days to shoot and a $10 million budget, and it was like, you got to get this movie done, and you know, you only have so much of the sunset. The gloaming is what it was called in the script.
Yeah.
What was important to me, because at the time that we were having these conversations about Colin Kaepernick and you know, what we realize in America it is to be other, that you are good and you can have a comfortable life as long as you don't object to what the patriarchy has decided is the way. And if you object and don't bend the knee, then there will be consequences. And so we're having these big conversations about critical race theory today, which is such a, like, I mean, I think that McAuliffe might even end up losing Virginia as a result of it. It looks like, I hope not, but it looks that way. So when I think about the Confederate flag and I think about that one shot and coming into this really beautiful burnt orange sky with the plantation and the little girl skipping, and everything is just so beautiful, it was important to us that it be a oneer so that we could move from all of that idyllic beauty and then get to the back of the house so that you could see the real horror that is underpinning or supporting this facade. It wasn't easy, and thank God that we had someone who was, you know, in our DP, Pedro Luke, that had the determination, the same determination as we did to get it done. But I appreciate that you appreciate the shot.
It's gorgeous. Tell me how you and Christopher, who we said is unfortunately not here this evening, but how you, as a writer, director duo and a couple, coming from different backgrounds, how does that enhance or potentially challenge the material? And I work with my husband, so I've got my ears wide open to how to make that work.
I'll tell you that, we've been together for 14 years, and it's not, it's one of those things where we live, eat, and drink the work, but we've learned how to debate, and I'm being diplomatic when I say that. We've learned how to sort of, argue some of the points in a really constructive way, because at the end of the day, it's the art and the story that matters. And so our rule of thumb is to say, let's default in the debate to the person who feels the most passionate about a particular thing, because that must be the way. But we've made it work over the years. I think on the writing side of it, I don't know about the other writers, who every writer on this panel I have such admiration for, but I think that for me, I require a certain level of solitude in order to write, and everything needs to be just so. So I get up in the morning and everything's the same. Like I have this bonsai tree here. I have everything that's the exact same. My Brian Eno that I play, like everything's kind of the same. And then Christopher is much more of a nocturnal person. So, we'll meet back like after I've had my 6 or 7 hours of writing, then we can come back and exchange. He'll edit my stuff, I edit his, and we can come to an agreement, a consensus, hopefully. And sometimes when we don't speak for 2 or 3 days, but like it'll, we tried the best that we can to make it work and to be constructive about it, because at the end of the day, these scripts, these stories, they're our little babies, from working with your husband, and you want to see them born into the world. And it needs to come from a place that's honest and authentic. It doesn't necessarily need to come from a nice place. It needs to come from an authentic place.
Right. Because we challenge each other, right, when we're working together. So like the Coen brothers, they just say they just take naps. That probably would work out too.
And keep a flask handy.
Yes, exactly. So as activist filmmakers who've, taken on the American sin of slavery, like, what do you guys want to do next?
Well, we have a documentary that we're working on called All Delivered Speed, which is about the desegregation of the US public school system. Gabrielle Sidibe is directing that. We have our TV show, HBO, about Black surfers, but it's about something so much more. It's got this crazy science fiction twist. I've been very fortunate because we've been in LA for 4 years, and just everything is kind of, it's been pretty good. So for me and for Christopher, what is most important is to create work that moves us. I think that there are plenty of amazing writers and filmmakers that are telling stories purely for entertainment value. I'm here to disturb people's peace. I'm here to catalyze a national dialogue around a whole host of really urgent issues. I think that as I'm sitting here today, we all know that we're grappling with a climate catastrophe. We have a great white shark, as Bill Maher would say, and Donald Trump, that's simply out to see who's coming back. I just think the xenophobia, the Texas, my home state, Chris and I, our relationship, our marriage might not even be recognized in the state of Texas in the next couple of months if they have their way. So what I recognize is that all of our rights individually, if we are not hyper vigilant, are temporary. And so as an artist, as a writer, as a director, I feel a responsibility to use my platform and my art in order to amplify these issues and activate people into action. So that's what I'm about. So anything that we're working on, that's what it'll look like. I also don't want to be preachy. I don't want to make films and television that is wagging my finger at people. Like that's
balance. Yeah.
No one cares about that. You know what I mean? I love what James and Gigi said about smuggling the message. And I think it's important that people, that people laugh and that people can also be made to feel uncomfortable without being made to feel uncomfortable. Do you know what I mean? Like there's a difference. And so there's a balance that you kind of have to toggle.
I was writing a social horror during the Trump 4 years, and just it kept on changing the balance. It had to. I mean, we had to adjust every 5 seconds. So thank you, Gerard. I'm going to move on to April. April, the original Black Christmas is a cult classic from the 1970s. It essentially dealt with abortion rights in a time Roe versus Wade, something that's still being challenged today. So talk about reimagining it with a new commentary on gender and politics.
Yeah, I mean, when the first one came out, I think people forget too that it was also a time when women could go to certain universities that they weren't allowed to go to. So like this is really like very recent that like women were allowed to like go to universities, be there, have a sorority, and then talk openly about maybe having an abortion. And I mean, to me, it's like right on the forefront of all of it. But it's so funny because when it was announced that we were redoing it, it was like that women were going to be writing and directing. All of the responses that we got from just like all of these people on Twitter, men specifically, were like, they're going to make it a feminist movie. And it was just like, well, and it's kind of funny because we felt really kind of driven by that. I'm in a different position too, because I was writing towards my director's strengths and what she wanted to do. And I'm trying to fulfill those things and the obligations of a PG-13 rating, which is, a mainstream kind of theatrical release, these things, at the same time trying to quote unquote say something. But something happened during the making of this, and the fact that we only had less than 3 months to write the script was that we were just really mad about everything. And I think when you have more time to write, what you do is you kind of let some things like distill, and you're like, well, I'll just do this more elegantly. But what we did was just like, fuck it, we're just gonna lean into it. Like we just sat down in New Zealand with our head in our hands, being like someone shared like a Jordan Peterson speech with us, and we were like, fuck this guy. And so the only thing that we could do is have it just like kind of prefrontal, like undeveloped lobe, but just kind of put it on the page and be like, you know what, fuck it, we're just gonna lean into it. It might be a little kitsch, it might be a little camp here, tone's gonna be fucking weird, but we're just gonna put it in there and see what happens, because we just didn't want to do it half-assed. And something that was really interesting was like we were seeing that all these years of smuggling these messages into horror films, because I love horror. I've been a genre freak my entire life since I was a kid. And I saw things in the same way that James is talking about, those certain people who don't see messages because they don't want to see them. I was sitting there and I was just like, well, what if you make a movie where they have to see it? And you know what? It might make some people mad, but it might make some other people happy. And, the position that we were put in was so rare, where we were actually allowed to do this stuff and, put in multiple shots of a menstrual cup that we thought was hilarious.
We would get, like, it's sort of a trophy for,
And we would get non-menstruating people who didn't know what that was, and they would just be like, what was that? And we were like, okay, let me tell you what this is. And we just thought it was really funny to be able to put like weird winking things into a certain demographic that doesn't always get catered to, and that like they might understand it and they might get the joke in a way that some other people won't. So like we were accused of having no text and like having subtext be text, and like fair, we know, but like there is another subtext below that if you are a certain viewer, you're going to get it, and you may not be that certain person who's going to get it immediately. You could also ask a friend.
Yeah, exactly. Or listen to one of your podcasts. Yeah. I can't believe you, by the way, brought up Jordan Peterson, who I also watched during something I was writing. And I don't know if you've ever seen the interviews with his daughter. You ever seen any of those? Those are infuriating.
Scary shit.
Yeah.
Real scary shit. That is wild stuff. But that's reality. And that's something that we were doing, something that like, you know, like Gigi and James, everyone, we're all talking about the fact that like, you know, real life is actually a cartoon right now. And we're like in movies, we're trying to pretend that it's not a cartoon, you know, like we're more sophisticated. I'm like, oh, fuck that. Everything is so fucked right now. Our villain's going to be arch. Like I'm so happy that y'all brought up Prince of Darkness, because that is one of my favorite Carpenters. I actually just interviewed Carpenter for NPR recently, and he's very political. He just doesn't say it into the But we talked about Prince of Darkness because it was a huge inspiration for Black Christmas for me. In just terms of like this kind of ancient evil that you can't understand and you can't explain. And it just exists, and it doesn't really feel like there's a way to stop it. But it's
liquid evil.
Yes. But you know, like it's to me very Carpenter-esque, and I think Carpenter is one of those filmmakers who can be either completely on the nose or, you know, like obscure in his messages. And I just love his dichotomy that sometimes he can swing both ways, whereas just like in Prince of Darkness, he's going to have these huge monologues with Donald Pleasance and James Wan just going on and on and on about God and science, and I'm like, yes, this is the shit I want.
So tell us about sort of, you know, because horror is a great Trojan horse, right? For, you know, pointing the lens somewhere, and then you have to strike a balance between, you know, the idea of a slasher and female empowerment. So talk about how you did that. Were those conversations you had beforehand? Were they found more in editorial? Just tell us a little bit about your process.
Well, again, process was so truncated that I had to throw a lot of ideas at the director, Sophia Takal, who's lovely and wonderful. The thing is that like she started getting super depressed about killing women on screen in a slasher thing, like kind of knocking them off one by one. And I was like, we could do like the humor of it. I can lean into that. And she was like, like, I don't want to do like a full horror comedy, but then I was just like, we could do a supernatural thing to build distance for you so that it doesn't feel as real in that sense. And she was just like, yes. So then I had to kind of build out a supernatural element to it. So, you know, I kind of like had to re-engineer, which is, it's not like the original Black Christmas in that sense. And in fact, I mean, it could have a different title and it would probably work. It may have even worked better, but you know, she had free reign to essentially do whatever she wanted that she felt comfortable with in reimagining what this title could be. Of course, the original Black Christmas will always be there. Thank you, Bob Clark. But in terms of building that distance so she would feel comfortable as a director, you know, staying with us in the long term, I was like, okay, well, by long term, it's like a few months because we were in theaters shortly thereafter. So she felt better about that. I wrote to that. PG-13 for a mainstream theatrical meant that I couldn't do a lot of the things that I wanted to do. There was, for instance, despite the fact that I think giallo types of shots are not particularly bloody or, you know, disgusting. Like I think that they should be able to pass some of the censors, you know, the way that they're done. We weren't able to get any of those in, and that was pretty tough for me because that's one of the things that I love about the original Black Christmas is that it does have this giallo roots to it, and I wanted to kind of honor that in the shots that we were doing. And so, you know, certain things with mirrors and eyeballs and stuff, you know, we were not allowed to do. And part of that was because of our mentioning of the word rape and the content of it being about, you know, kind of like a weird rape revenge film in that sense. Because if you were trying to get a PG-13 rating through the MPA, it meant that you couldn't have any blood. There couldn't be anything, it couldn't do, all of the stuff that I wanted to do, because we had that social aspect to it. So I had to give up one part of the social horror that I wanted, which was the blood and the kills, to get the other part that was smuggled in, because it was a PG-13. So man, my kingdom for an R or a streaming, that's what I would prefer. That's what I would have wished we could have had, but we didn't. But in terms of getting around that, that supernatural element did help me a little bit, because I was able to make the blood black. And as long as I was able to change the color of it, I was able to get some of it in. And so that's the kind of negotiation that I had in terms of writing and trying to get to that PG-13 and get to everything that I wanted.
Gotcha. Talk about the final girl, historically that, women have sort of been the brunt of the body count. And then, in your film, like, it's more female agency, and like just sort of, the idea of how the final girl is evolving in general, like in storytelling.
Well, I think it's weird because I don't often think that the final girl is evolving. And I think that might be the issue for me for a lot of things, because I do a lot of horror scholarship, and I Carol Clover, I know all the final girl, like, scholarship on it, like what people are writing, what people are doing. And I think that it's one of the few things that we as horror writers sometimes latch onto a little bit too much. And this is all genders who latch onto it, because it's such a very specific kind of horror ideal. And I do feel like it's the thing that is often slowest to change, is like the one last standing woman. And so one of the things that we really wanted to do was not have that, and actually go in the exact opposite manner, and try to withhold that it, assume that it's going to be a final girl, but it's not, So there was a kind of reversal of that, an extreme reversal, to the point where people got so mad at us. Like, I would get so much hate mail about how we fucked up the final girl thing, and like, it's not supposed to be a lot of women. And I was like, I'm so sorry, but like, I mean, this one movie, you get all the other ones, come on, like. So
so we've seen, social horrors vibrant in international cinema, in films like His House, Tigers Are Not Afraid, The Guatemalan La Llorona, to name a few. What global issues, this can be for April and for everyone actually, but what global issues sort of keep you up at night and that you want to tackle in the future? And I know, Gerard, you mentioned obviously our planet and climate change. So let's start with you, April. Something you want to do?
Trying to think of all the things that I'm writing right now.
Or are doing.
What am I writing? I do think, climate change is the existential threat that is probably going to be, explored more fully through everything, but just the kind of dwindling of populations and rising up. I've always been very interested in class inequalities, because I grew up in a very poor household with a single teen mom, and had to struggle a lot early in my life, and was in close proximity to, like, literally Betsy DeVos and her family, like where my town is. So you're living with, like, right next door to some of the richest people in a small town, Midwestern life. And so I'm really fascinated by class inequality and all of its expressions globally. And I think that that's something that could be understood in a universal sense.
Yeah. Parasite did that so beautifully.
I also think that the weaponization of religion and misinformation and disinformation is really, that's something that we're going to have to, not going to have to, that we're dealing with right now, but I think it's only a scintilla of what it's going to be. Mm-hmm. And that's how we can continue to divide people and to distract people while the world burns. And that's a real problem.
Oh yeah. So I mean, that's why cults are so big right now. Like cult content. There's just like so many shows, documentaries about that because, but then of course, I think what Gerard is saying is just like that entrenched like Christianity side of it that I think look, religious horror is one of my faves, you guys. Let's bring it back.
I would love to see that, like how Ari did Midsummer. Like, I would love to see something where they do a religious horror where, because if you watch some of those documentaries, like I saw this one where this woman, she basically led this entire church, made all of this money and she encouraged her members to beat their children. She was crazy. And she ended up dying in a plane crash. But the idea of how these Christian right people putting a horror lens on that, I think would be absolutely, I'm not doing it, but I think it would be absolutely riveting to watch.
I love that idea. Just also with social media being such a fire hose of, misinformation and the Congress sort of, deciding on all that stuff now, it's just terrifying and ripe for a next horror wave. So I think I want to come back to George because I want to talk about, maybe you can talk about the book you're writing kind of post, you mentioned it as the 2016 horror renaissance, and tell us what that's about and yeah, give us some information about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, you got some snippets of it early on there, but I'm just really fascinated, not only is somehow, Donald Trump the monster that media created, but I sort of feel that you all have a special mission to be able to, all of your talents, I think, are well kind of calibrated to bring down the monster that sort of media created. If his rise to power comes partially through the amount of oxygen that he was given between 2015 and 2016, I think there's a real sense in which the work that you are all doing is a part of containing that. That's at least partially, how I look at it. And I've just been so fascinated by just how, one of the things I think separates these most recent movies, from the films of the past is just how confrontational, right, their stances are, right? Especially, I think, James DeMonico's, all of your films, you just tell it like it is, right? Oftentimes my students kind of are interested in the fact that you don't really conceal your commentary, right, in your films. And I think they find that really bracing, that, there are times when urgency calls for that kind of forthrightness and candidness in filmmaking. There's something really refreshing about that too, not pulling punches.
Yeah, there's not much subtlety there, but yeah, I get I think I don't know who said they got a lot of hate mail. I get a lot of hate mail because of it too. So it's I'm happy to hear people like it also, that we're not concealing my thoughts in anything. So,
well, if you're provoking a reaction, this is the best.
Yes,
right?
yes. Very strong reaction.
Exactly.
Yeah. My wife wants to move sometimes, so yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that means James, that means that you're doing your job, because like art is supposed to divide people. It's supposed to cause a conversation. You're doing your job beautifully. So,
oh, thank you guys. Yeah. It's it's what we're supposed to do. But yeah, and I'm babbling, but it could be a little scary at times when you read some of the hatred out there. I think it's but we can't stop in the face of that. I know that. So it's I don't know what it is. It's scary.
I think also what we're seeing is that America, I don't know about you guys, but we're not nearly as smart of a country as I thought we were. And I think that the subtlety and the nuance that we thought that they were smart enough to get in this new age where they've been so dumbed down, we've become as a population. So it's kind of crazy. I think that some of it requires that we're really confrontational and really urgent with the messaging, because they might not get it otherwise. They're distracted by their phones.
Absolutely.
They're distracted by the latest, like it's a sugar high.
Mhm.
And so it's really, how can you get them and grab them and have a, like, I was listening to April rather intently, because, you know, I understand what she was saying and talking about when, you know, you want to be able to deliver certain messages and you've got these really rigid constructs that you have, parameters that you have to wiggle between. But then on top of that, you've got this audience that, you know, their attention span is really short. And you're going to have to grab them quickly, or at least the thing that's most important that you're trying to say, that they can latch onto that and talk about it amongst their friends and spread it and create a conversation around it. I think as filmmakers, as writers today, there is a completely different way that we have to go about doing this work to reach these people. It's very different than it was, I think, just 10 years ago. I think to me, maybe I'm wrong, but that's just the sense that I get.
I can't believe we have 5 minutes left. I have a million more questions. I think I just want to quickly, for fun, just tell us about the films in this genre that influenced you, or the filmmakers. We literally have 5 minutes left, so maybe we can just go around or maybe recommend some to, you know, people watching us tonight, all that kind of fun stuff. James, you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. I'll bring up someone I hope that we didn't hear about tonight. I was going to say John Carpenter. I love John Carpenter. He's my hero. But if you guys, I'm assuming you all saw Larry Cohen stuff. Larry Cohen's amazing. Check out any Larry Cohen film. The Stuff is an amazing socio-political film. George Romero is another one, but everybody talks about Night of the Living Dead. Watch The Crazies. So those are two I'll just throw out there for now. But Larry Cohen's amazing, and he's not spoken enough in our genre. So we should talk about Larry Cohen more. I'll pass it off.
Gerard, how about you?
I'm a Kubrick fanatic. I love Kubrick a lot, and I like the fact that hidden, even like when you're talking about The Shining, you know, right within that movie, like when you watch the film, he talks about the racism of that group of really powerful white men. It's right under your nose. It's just not, you have to pay attention to it. So yeah, I really love Kubrick.
April?
All of them.
This is like a Halloween.
I've been on like a one-woman. Yeah, I've been on like a one-woman crusade to get everyone to watch Matt Simber's The Witch Who Came from the Sea for like years.
Great movie.
I haven't seen that one.
It's great. It's on Amazon now.
Like
I think you watch it.
Dean Cundy early.
Yep.
It's great. Arrow did a release of that too. And then also Larry Cohen. I mean, we're talking about that. Like God Told Me To.
God
is
Told
one
Me
of my
To.
favorites of his. It's
Incredible.
like,
yeah. Gaspar Noé. Gaspar Noé might remake it. April.
I was wondering, because it's one of those. It's like it's right for this time. That's what Gerard was saying too. Where it's just like this is like the time where you do this particular movie.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are my big ones. Obviously, you know, everyone should revisit Prince of Darkness and, you know, In the Mouth of Madness, since we're talking about Carpenter. And I have too many to name, but maybe that's just the start.
Anyone else want to jump in? Gigi?
Pretty much everyone took my answers, but because I was like, oh, no one said this. Oh, they said it. No one said that. Oh, they said it. I was like, even the stuff was brought up. I'm like, damn it. But you know, one of the things that I will share, I teach directing at Vancouver Film School, and a lot of these students, you know, it shocks me that they don't watch classic films. They don't watch anything before maybe the 90s. Like they're like, oh, I saw Scream. I'm like, have you seen
Oh.
anything before that? And you know, so to me, you know, I always try to recommend them because I love talking about social horror so much in my class. I'm always like, guys, homework is Rosemary's Baby. Homework is The Fly. Homework is, you know, and I really try to get them to just watch films from late 70s and 80s. There was such an intense, I mean, I'm not born from those times. I'm from the 90s, but I mean, I remember watching those films that talk on these, that are consciously, you know, talking about the breakout of AIDS and talk about very, very important subjects that it just shocks me that audiences just don't go back in time and watch good classic films. So rather than saying just a director or filmmaker, I just want to encourage that, you know, I think we've been making social horror for a very, very long time. That definitely, I just want to encourage watch older films that talk about this.
Yeah, whenever you say like The Night of the Hunter to younger students, they're like, I don't want to watch it as black and white. And then they watch it, they're like, oh, this is my favorite fucking movie.
Right? Right. Right. Yeah.
There's a
Yeah.
new film, Spontaneous. I don't know if anyone's seen that, but it's got a really interesting.
Brian
Yeah, I
Fuller.
love how they kind of bury the whole gun control issue, but it's a really fantastic commentary if you haven't seen that.
Where do you watch it?
You mentioned, I'm sorry, you mentioned Carpenter. Anyone else you want to talk about? Brian?
Oh, I would bring up Ridley Scott and Alien just in terms of a visceral aesthetic reaction to a horror story, because that was definitely the first film where I became aware of production design and lenses and the type of lighting that was really all about craft overlaid on a very simple horror story, but it was so beautifully produced and executed that I love a good-looking horror movie, whether it's The Hunger or, speaking of the Scott boys, there's something to elegant horror that is part, I guess as a queer man, I like it if it's pretty. I mean, I want it to look good, and that goes way back. I think one of the things, what you were saying, Gigi, that I would love for people to sort of just consider movies during the time that they were told, because I think so much of what's happening now informs the movies, and it's interesting to look at the vampire movies in the 80s, amongst the AIDS crisis, and how movies like Fright Night really had something interesting to say, whether the storytellers knew that they were telling those, getting that deep into the tiramisu. But for any horror fan, go back to James Whale. And you can chart so much of what happens in Hollywood through James Whale and sort of his pre-code movies and his post-code movies. And this is a guy who learned, how to tell stories in a prisoner of war camp in World War I. So his ferocity and specificity and storytelling. Just watch Frankenstein, The Invisible Man, and Bride of Frankenstein, and there's an amazing arc of an artist there who is telling stories from the monster's point of view for the first time. So that's, I would say, yes, go to the 80s, yes, go to the 70s, but go all the way back to the 30s as well, because there's so much wonderful horror that we should be constantly celebrating, because all of these tales are told within the times that they were produced, and all of them have really crazy metaphors once you start rolling back history with film history. It's a delightful hole to go into.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Great. Wells is a great recommendation. Unfortunately, it's all the time we have. I'm just looking up at the clock. It's already 7:30. So I just want to thank you all for being here. This was so much fun, and I appreciate you sharing your time and experiences and compelling work with us. I also need to thank the WGA and the Genre Committee And a shout out to Steve Holbert and my subcommittee and our liaison, Greg Mitchell, who we love and gives such great guidance. Thank you, Greg. And I just want to thank you all for joining us in this conversation about genre writing. And if we remember anything, remember that they're here. They're already here. Good night, everybody.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.